I'm Adrienne Calloway, 50 years old, and I'm the Army general who spent 30 years building the weapons that bring soldiers home. The quiet work nobody photographs. For 2 decades, I let my own family call it nothing, swallowed every joke about the woman behind the desk, and stood at my mother's table, unable to defend what I did. But the morning a colonel waved me off my own firing line and called me sweetheart, the test director walked past him and handed me the firing key, and everything those 20 years had been hiding finally came out in front of everyone. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who had no idea who you really were? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand quietly in your own worth while someone underestimated you to your face, hit that like button and subscribe. The first time my father let me hold a sectioned training round, I was 12 years old, standing on an upturned milk crate in our garage because I was too short to reach the workbench. It was the late 1980s. He had spread an old towel across the wood and laid the pieces out in order, the way other fathers laid out Christmas lights, and he talked me through every part of it in the low, even voice he used for things that mattered. He had been a first sergeant in the field artillery for almost 30 years, and he treated that hunk of inert metal like a sermon. My brother Nathan, 2 years older, wanted to know how loud the real ones were. He always wanted to know how loud. He would lean in the garage doorway and ask my father about the biggest gun he had ever fired, the closest he had ever been to a blast, whether it knocked your teeth loose. My father would answer him, patient enough, but his eyes would drift back to me and the pieces on the towel because I was the one asking a different question. I wanted to know how they made it land where they aimed it. That was the whole split of my childhood, right there in the garage. My brother loved the bang. I loved the part nobody clapped for. The arithmetic that decided whether a soldier 10 miles away on the other side of a ridge lived through the morning or did not. To Nathan, the artillery was thunder. To me, it was a promise, made by people he would never see, that the thunder would come down on the right square of earth. Anybody can pull a lanyard, Addie, my father told me once, screwing the inert fuse back into its casing with his thick, careful hands. The Army's whole life depends on the few who make sure it hits what we aimed at. Those people don't get parades. You understand me? They get to know. That has to be enough for them because most days it's all they'll get. I told him it would be enough for me. I was 12. I had no idea how long a promise like that takes to test. Inside the house, my mother had a softer and more worried set of hopes for me. Diane Calloway had spent her whole marriage on or near Army posts, and she had decided somewhere along the way that she did not want her daughter to inherit the life. She wanted me to have something she called normal, by which she meant quieter, cleaner, with fewer men and less machinery in it. There are 100 things a smart girl can do, Adrienne, she said to me one night over dishes, her hands in the gray water, her voice careful. Why pick the one thing that's all boots and grease and shouting? I did not have an answer that would have satisfied her. I only knew that the garage made sense to me in a way that very little else did, and that when my father explained a firing solution, I felt the floor of the world go solid under my feet. Nathan turned it into comedy early, the way older brothers do. He would introduce me to his friends as the girl who was going to grow up to do math for the Army. He did not mean it cruelly, not then. It was just that in our family, my father's career was the loud and admirable thing, the gun line, the field problems, the war stories, and anything quieter than that read as a smaller life. Nathan wanted the loud thing. He just wanted it in a suit, with a paycheck, which is more or less how he ended up where he ended up. I enlisted the summer I turned 18 in 1994. I went in as a cannon crew member because that was my father's world, and I wanted to stand in it, but the Army has a way of finding what you are actually good at, and within my first year somebody noticed that I was fast and clean with a gunnery solution. They pulled me into the Fire Direction Center, the small, cramped tent full of charts and radios, where the math actually happens, and for the first time in my life, I was prized for exactly the thing my family had treated as a quirk. I cannot tell you what that did to me. For 18 years, the people who loved me had handled my talent like a strange hobby, something to be tolerated and gently steered away from. The Army looked at the same talent and called it a weapon. It put me in a chair that mattered and trusted me with other people's lives. I had never in my life felt so useful, and I was barely old enough to vote. By the time I was 22, I was a sergeant, running solutions in the Fire Direction Center for a battery that trained hard and at night. I remember one live fire in particular, a black field somewhere cold, the kind of dark where you navigate by the red glow of instruments. A solution came through from another section, and something in it sat wrong with me. The numbers were plausible. They were also, if you walk them all the way out, going to march a string of rounds toward a hill where an observation team was dug in. I caught it, I reran it, I flagged it, I corrected it, and the rounds fell where they were supposed to fall, and the observation team finished their night never knowing how close the math had come to killing them. My battery commander found out what I had done and looked at me for a long moment afterward. The way people look at you when they are quietly revising their estimate of you upward. Nobody outside that tent would ever know. That was the entire point of the job. You did it right precisely so that nothing happened, so that the night stayed boring, so that everyone went home and complained about the cold and not about the funeral. The reward was a private one. It was knowing. I called my father the next morning from a bank of payphones and I told him the whole thing, the bad solution and the catch and the silence afterward. He was quiet for a while on his end. Then he said the thing I have carried for 30 years, the thing I would spend half my life trying to make other people say and never quite getting them to. That's the one thing the Army can't build, Addie, he said. It can build the gun. It can't build the person who refuses to let it be wrong. You've got that. Don't you ever let anybody tell you it's small. I told him I wouldn't. I meant it. I just did not yet know how many of them were going to try. I was selected for officer candidate school and commissioned a second lieutenant in the year 2000 when I was 24. My father drove a long way to be there. He stood in the back in a sport coat that did not quite fit him anymore. And when they pinned the gold bar on me, his face did something I had only seen a handful of times, a kind of stillness that was the loudest thing he ever did. My mother was proud too, in her way, but her pride came wrapped in a question. She wanted to know whether becoming an officer meant I would finally be getting out of what she called the dangerous part. When I tried to explain that I was actually moving toward weapons development and testing, toward the long, unglamorous business of making sure the systems that reach soldiers actually work, I watched her relief curdle into confusion. Nathan, who by then had finished a business degree and talked his way into his first job with a defense firm, smirked at me across the reception. "So, you went through all that," he said, "to end up behind a desk. Dad spent 30 years on the gun line, and you're going to go write requirements, documents." My father set down his cup. He did not raise his voice. He never had to. "Somebody wrote the requirements for the gun that kept me alive in places you've never heard of, son," he said. "You just never met them. That's the whole point of them. You never had to." Nathan let it go, the way he let most things my father said go, with a shrug and a change of subject. But the sentence had landed on me, not on him. Somebody wrote the requirements for the gun that kept me alive. I had spent my childhood loving the math of where the round came down. Now the Army was offering me the chance to stand even further back in the chain to the place where you decide whether the gun is good enough to be trusted at all. It was the least visible position I could possibly take. It was also, I was beginning to understand, one of the most important, and I wanted it with my whole chest. 4 years later, in 2004, I was a captain in Iraq, serving as a fire support officer. I will not turn that deployment into a war story, because it was not one. And because the part that changed me was not loud. The part that changed me was a piece of equipment that failed when people were counting on it. A system that somebody, somewhere, years before, had signed off on as ready when it was not. I watched good soldiers nearly die in the gap between what a weapon was promised to do and what it actually did under a desert sun with sand in everything. I decided, sitting in the dark after that the desk my brother mocked was a fighting position. The paperwork was armor. Every test I would ever run, every milestone I would ever refuse to sign until the data was real, was a way of standing between a soldier and the moment I had just watched. I came home from that deployment with a mission that has never once left me. I would not let a system that was not ready reach a person who was trusting it with their life. Not if I could put my body in the way. That mission is invisible from the outside. That is its nature. When you do it well, nothing happens, the same as in the fire direction tent at 22. The round lands true, the soldier comes home, and no one ever knows there was a version of the story where the equipment failed and the family got a folded flag. You are the absence of a tragedy. Try putting that on a thumbnail. Try explaining it at Thanksgiving. I made major in 2008 and moved fully into the acquisition core, into test and evaluation, into the world of long programs and longer meetings. And the family joke, which had started as Nathan's lazy comedy at my commissioning, hardened over the years into the official story of who I was. By the time I was a major, Nathan was a rising man at his firm, full of words like operator and trigger puller and end user, words he used to mean the people who mattered, by which he meant not me. At a family gathering around 2012, he held the room the way he liked to, talking about the warfighters his company supported, and then he waved a hand at me as the punchline. "Addie does important stuff too, everybody," he said, grinning. "She picks out what color the binders are at the Pentagon." People laughed. My mother laughed. It was not a mean laugh. It was worse than a mean laugh. It was an easy one, the laughter of people who had simply accepted, long ago, that whatever I did was small and faintly funny, and who felt comfortable enough with that conclusion to say it out loud over pie. The thing is, I could not even defend myself. A great deal of what I did then was classified. I sat at my own mother's table with a security clearance that would not let me tell her why her daughter's work was not a joke. So I did what I always did. I smiled, and I passed the potatoes, and I let the story of the binders stand because the truth was not mine to hand out. There was one more lesson in those years, and it did not come from my family. It came from a development test range around 2016 when I was a lieutenant colonel running a product line. A line colonel had come out to observe, the kind of officer who treated the acquisition team like hired help. And during the briefing, he kept talking over me and directing his questions to the male contractor standing at my shoulder on the simple assumption that the man was in charge and I was support. I let the data answer him. I always did. By the end of the briefing, he understood his mistake in the limited way men like that ever do. But I walked back to my vehicle that afternoon, having learned something I would not fully feel until a firing line 10 years later. It was not personal, what he had done. It was a reflex. To a certain kind of man, the woman with the clipboard is always the help, automatically, before she has said a word. I had stopped expecting otherwise a long time ago. I had not stopped noticing. I want to be clear about that. I let it go 1,000 times, but I never once failed to see it. And I kept my awards in a box in a closet instead of on a wall, and I told myself the work was the point, which was true. And I tried not to admit how much I still wanted the people I loved to look at the box. My father died in 2019 at 71, the year I made colonel. He never saw me promoted to general. I want you to hold on to that, because it sits underneath everything that happened on the morning I am about to tell you about. The way a foundation sits under a house you only notice when it cracks. I pinned on my first star in 2022 and took over as the program executive officer for a long-range precision fire system, which is a long way of saying I was the general responsible for building a new family of weapons and getting them right before they ever reached a soldier. 10 years of my professional life and the lives of hundreds of engineers and testers had been poured into the system we were finally going to fire for record on the 9th of June, 2026, at a remote Army proving ground. A milestone live fire test is the closest thing my world has to a championship game. It is the day the modeling either becomes real or becomes embarrassing. Everyone who has anything to do with the program shows up, along with operational sponsors, contractors, and brass who want to be photographed near success. I had every right to make that morning about me. I had earned the star and the seat and the spotlight. I did not want it. I wanted the morning to be about them, the engineers and the test crew who had actually built the thing. So I made a decision that I have made many times in my career and have never once regretted, even on that day. I left the stars in the car. I drove out to the line in a plain dark blazer and slacks. No uniform, no entourage, just my aide a few steps back, and I walked up to the edge of the firing line like anybody who belonged there. Because I did. My aide that morning was Sergeant First Class Bianca Ortega, 34 years old and the best non-commissioned officer I have ever worked beside. A woman who reads a room the way I read a firing solution. I had asked her to hang back and let me watch the final checks in peace. She did, though I could feel her watching me the way she watched everything, ready. The firing line was alive with that particular pre-shot energy, technicians on headsets, the great clean shape of the system pointed downrange, the test director's team moving through their safety pole. I stood at the edge of it with my hands in my pockets and felt, for a moment, the way I had felt at 12 on the milk crate. Here was the thing I loved, the promise made of metal and mathematics, about to keep itself in front of everyone. That was when Colonel Lawrence Dawes noticed me. I knew his name from the manifest, not his face. He was the operational sponsor, an artillery colonel, 53, the kind of officer who had spent his career on the using end of weapons, and very little of it on the building end, and who carried the easy contempt that some line officers carry for everyone in acquisitions. He had never met me. He saw a woman in civilian clothes standing too close to his live firing line, and his whole posture changed. "Ma'am," he called, walking toward me with one hand already up, hurting. "Range is closed, sweetheart. Contractors wait in the tent. This is a live line, not a tour." A couple of the officers near him smiled. Not big smiles, the small, reflexive ones that men give each other when one of them is handling a minor inconvenience with authority. "I'm with the program, Colonel," I said. "I'll stay out of your way." "The program waits in the tent, too," he said, and his voice had that patient, final quality, the voice you use on someone you have already filed under, not important. He looked past me to my aide. "Ortega, walk her back." Bianca did not move. She looked at me instead, one quick glance, a question, and an offer in it, asking whether she should end this right now, whether she should say the word that would turn the whole line around. I gave her the smallest shake of my head. "Not yet. Let it play." I have learned in 50 years that there is a particular value in letting a man finish showing you exactly who he is, all the way to the bottom, before anything interrupts him. It is not cruelty. It is data. So Colonel Dawes stood there, mildly annoyed, certain, waving a woman he had decided was nobody toward a tent, in front of a line of people, on the proudest morning of my professional life. And I let him. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that the safety pole behind him had just finished. And the person who runs that pole, the person with the final authority over whether a single thing happens on that range, was already walking toward us. Dr. Marion Keller had been the civilian test director at that proving ground for longer than Colonel Dawes had been a colonel. 61 years old, silver-haired, a member of the senior executive service. She had forgotten more about live fire safety than most of the uniforms on that line would ever learn. She finished her poll, lifted her eyes, and saw me standing where Dawes was trying to herd me from. She did not hurry. She walked the length of the firing line in her steady, unbothered way, and she walked straight past Colonel Dawes as if he were a cone, and she stopped in front of me. In her open hand was the firing key, the literal key that authorized the shot, the small, unremarkable object that the entire 10 years came down to. "General Calloway," she said, clear enough for the line to hear. "Range is green, safety's verified. We don't shoot until you say so." She held out the key. I have replayed the next 3 seconds more times than I can count. The word general did all the work. It traveled down that firing line like a cold front, and you could see it move, could see each face catch it and turn. The officers who had smiled a minute ago were suddenly very busy, looking straight ahead. And Colonel Dawes went white. "General," he said. The word came out of him in pieces. "General Calloway, ma'am. I wasn't aware that you were the... I apologize, ma'am, I didn't realize." I let him find the bottom of it. Then I reached out and took the firing key from Dr. Keller's hand, and I felt its small, cool weight settle into my palm, and I looked at the colonel who had just tried to send me to the tent. He came to attention. The same hand that had waved me toward the back of the line came up sharp and correct to the brim of his cover, and Colonel Lawrence Dawes saluted the woman he had dismissed 30 seconds before. I returned it, because that is what you do, and because the salute was never the thing I had wanted from anyone. 50 feet away, in the contractor section, my brother Nathan lowered his coffee cup very slowly and stared at me as if he had never seen me before in his life, which, in a way that mattered, he never had. I walked into the control bunker with the firing key in my hand and the colonel's apology still hanging in the air behind me. And I did the thing I had come to, that proving ground, to do. The bunker was close and warm and full of screens and the smell of coffee gone cold. My test crew was there, the engineers who had spent 10 years on this, watching their displays with the particular tightness of people about to learn whether a decade was worth it. Dr. Keller took her place at the safety console. The range control officer ran the final count. And on the count, I turned the key. I did not see the round leave. You rarely do. What I saw was the data, the long, clean arc of it resolving across the screen exactly as the modeling had promised. And then, a beat later, the downrange camera showing the target where the target had been and then showing it gone. Precisely as designed, 10 years resolved into a few seconds of telemetry that matched the prediction so closely that one of my younger engineers actually laughed out loud, a single startled bark of disbelief and joy. The bunker erupted. People who had not stood up straight in hours were on their feet, hands over their mouths, gripping each other's shoulders. Dr. Keller looked at the trace, then looked at me, and allowed herself a small, dry smile. 10 years, General, she said. That's your shot. I had imagined that moment 1,000 times across those 10 years. I had pictured the trace, the target, the relief. I had never once imagined it with a colonel's apology still warm in the air behind me. And I confess that the two things sat strangely together, the largest professional triumph of my life, and the smallest, oldest, most personal ache, arriving in the same 60 seconds. I let my crew have the moment. It was theirs more than mine. I shook hands and I said names, because I knew their names, every one of them. And then I stepped back out into the daylight while they celebrated, because I needed a minute and because a general standing in the middle of an engineer's celebration changes the temperature of it. Bianca Ortega found me by the vehicles. She was not celebrating. She was furious in the contained, vibrating way of a good, non-commissioned officer who has watched her officer be disrespected and is restraining herself from fixing it permanently. "Ma'am," she said low, "he tried to have me frog march you off your own range, in front of everybody. You cannot just let that go." "I can let the man go," I said, "and still not let the lesson go. Those are different things, Bianca." "I don't see the difference today." "I know you don't," I said. "That's because you're 34 and you still think the point is to win the moment. The point is never the moment." She did not look convinced. I did not need her to be, not right away. She had given me, without knowing it, the shape of the decision I was going to have to make about Colonel Dawes. And I was grateful for the anger, even as I asked her to bank it. I walked a little away from the vehicles after that, to the edge of the range road where the desert opened up, flat and pale, toward the impact area. And I let myself feel the thing I had been holding off all morning. Everyone on that firing line now knew my rank. Not one of them knew the rest of it. Not one of them knew the 18-year-old in the fire direction tent, or the captain in Iraq watching a bad system nearly kill people she was sworn to protect, or the major smiling over pie while her own family called her work the choosing of binder colors. Not one of them knew the daughter who had built every bit of it, the whole long, invisible career, partly to be worthy of a man who had already, from the very beginning, thought she was. The star had made them turn around. That was all it had done. It had not reached back through the years and made any of it seen. It had simply made a colonel stop, the way the line officer in 2016 had eventually stopped, the way men always stopped once the evidence got too large to ignore. The recognition was real, and it was loud, and it was, in the way that mattered most to me, 20 years and one funeral too late. My phone buzzed that evening, back in my quarters, with my mother's number. I almost did not answer. I am glad I did, and I am not sure it helped. "Adrienne," she said, "Nathan called me. He said a colonel saluted you. He said there was some kind of moment on the range." She paused, and I could hear her trying to assemble a feeling out of information she did not have the frame for. Is that a big deal? I never know with your world. I never know which of the things you do are the big ones." And there it was, in my own mother's voice, gentle and bewildered and loving and completely unable to see the shape of my life. She was not mocking me. She had never really mocked me. She had simply spent 50 years standing in a room I had built and being unable to read a single word on the walls. "It was a big deal, Mom," I said. "It was a very big deal." "Well," she said, warmly, helplessly. "Good. That's good, sweetheart. I'm glad." I sat in the dark of my quarters for a long time after we hung up, turning the day over. The key had been handed back to Dr. Keller hours ago. The shot was a matter of record. The program had cleared its biggest hurdle in 10 years. And the one person I had wanted in that bunker, The one man who would have understood exactly what the trace on that screen meant and exactly what it had cost had been 7 years gone and would not be calling. The next morning, I had to decide what kind of victory the firing line was going to be. This is the part that people who love revenge stories never quite believe, so let me say it plainly. I could have ended Colonel Lawrence Dawes, not his life, his career. A one-star general has a long memory and a longer reach, and a colonel who publicly tries to remove the program executive officer from her own milestone test has handed that general everything she would ever need. A few sentences in the right ears, and Dawes would have spent his remaining years in the assignments that quietly tell a man the army is finished with him. It would have been easy, and a great many people, including my own furious sergeant, would have called it justice. I have never been interested in that kind of justice. Not because I am a saint, because it does not work. Burning a man down teaches him that he got caught and nothing else. He goes home and tells the story as the time the general overreacted, and he believes it, and he changes nothing. And the next woman in civilian clothes on the next firing line gets waved toward the next tent. The fire feels like accountability. It is just heat. So at the post-test after action the next morning, with Dawes and Dr. Keller and my program staff in the room, I did something worse to Colonel Dawes than ending him. I made him learn. "I'm not going to write you up, Colonel," I told him, and I watched the relief start across his face before I finished. "I'm going to do something you'll like less. For the next 2 days, you're going to sit with the engineers you called contractors yesterday. You're going to let them walk you through every failure we analyzed and every fix we built across 10 years. And when they're done, you're going to understand exactly what you almost waved off that line. Then you'll never do it to anyone again." He understood it was not a kindness. To his credit, he did not argue. He caught me in the hallway afterward, alone, and he tried to apologize in the only language men like him have for it, which is the language of excuses dressed as regret. "Ma'am, if you'd been in uniform," he said, "if I'd known your rank, I never would have. I want you to know that. I would never disrespect a general officer." I stopped and I looked at him, and I gave him the truest thing I had. "I know you wouldn't have," I said. "That's the part I need you to sit with, Colonel. You didn't disrespect my rank yesterday. You didn't know my rank. You disrespected a woman in a blazer that you had decided in about 1 second could not possibly matter on your firing line. The star didn't make you wrong. The star just made you stop. There are a lot of people who never get a star to make the men around them stop. I've been most of them." He did not have an answer for that. I did not expect one. I left him in the hallway with it, which was the only place the lesson could actually do its work. There was one more conversation I had to have, and it was harder than the colonel, because it was older. I met Nathan that afternoon at a diner off the post road, the kind of place with laminated menus and bottomless coffee where my family has always done its difficult talking. My brother, who had spent 30 years narrating my life as a smaller version of his own, sat across from me and could not quite meet my eyes. "I always thought you took the safe road, Addie," he said finally. "The desk, the meetings. I stood on that line yesterday, and I watched a colonel salute you, and I realized I don't even understand half of what you actually do. I've been telling people for years that you pick out binders. I know what you've been telling people, Nathan. I'm sorry." He turned his coffee cup in its saucer. "I think I needed you to be smaller so that what I do would feel bigger. That's an ugly thing to figure out about yourself at 52. I let that sit because it deserved to. Then I told him the truth, the same way I had told the colonel, without heat and without mercy. You don't have to understand it, I said. You're not an engineer, and you never will be, and that's fine. But you have to stop telling everyone it's nothing, because it isn't nothing, and somewhere in our family there's a 12-year-old version of some other girl listening to her loud, successful uncle explain that the quiet work doesn't count. Dad knew the difference. He knew it in the garage when we were kids. I never needed you to do the work, Nathan. I needed you to stop laughing at it. My brother is not a fast man with his feelings, but he is not a stupid one. He nodded slowly, and he did not reach for a joke, which for Nathan is the equivalent of another man weeping. That evening my phone rang again, and this time it was Lieutenant General Roy Sandoval, my old mentor and former boss, 60 years old and 3 stars, and entirely on my side. He had heard about the firing line, the way these stories travel, and he was, in his blunt way, ready to act. Say the word, Adrian, he said. And that colonel spends the rest of his career counting traffic cones at the most forgotten post in the inventory. Nobody waves my best program manager off her own range. It would have been so easy to say the word. I love that man, and a part of me wanted to hand the whole thing to him and let the system do what the system does to people who embarrass the wrong general. I'd rather he spend it actually seeing people, sir, I said. If you bury him, he learns he made a powerful enemy. If I make him sit with my engineers, he might learn he was wrong. One of those sticks. The other one just hires a grudge. Sandoval was quiet a moment. Then he laughed, low. Your father raised a dangerous woman, he said. Most people think revenge is the loud thing. My father raised me in a garage, sir, I said. He taught me the loud part is never the part that matters. I hung up, and I sat there aware that I had turned down the easy revenge twice in a single day, the sergeant's version and the general's version, and that for the first time in a long while, I felt something I could only describe as my father's approval, arriving from wherever such things arrive from when the man himself is gone. The consequences came the way real consequences do without my having to lift a hand for them. I did not go down to the engineering bay to watch Colonel Dawes serve his 2 days. I want to be honest about why. Part of it was leadership, the principle that a general hovering over a punishment turns it into theater and robs it of its teeth. But part of it, the part I am less proud of, was that I did not trust myself not to enjoy it, and I did not want to be a woman who enjoyed it. So I stayed away, and I let Bianca Ortega be my eyes, because she had wanted blood, and I thought she deserved to watch the slower thing instead. She reported back to me at the end of the first day, and she was wearing an expression I had not expected, something thoughtful, sitting where the anger had been. He came in performing, ma'am, she said. First couple hours, you could tell he was just enduring it, nodding, checking his watch, doing his time. And then somewhere around the 6th hour, one of the young engineers walked him through the guidance failure from the 3rd test year, the one that nearly killed the program, and how they ran it down and what they had to invent to fix it. She paused. And he stopped performing. He started asking real questions, the kind you ask when you actually want to know the answer. By the end of the day, he was taking notes. That was the only revenge I ever wanted, not the colonel humiliated. The colonel changed. The firing line story traveled, as I said. I did not spread it, and I did not need to. These things move through an institution on their own legs, and within a week, the way the senior leaders treated my program had quietly shifted. The room that used to talk over me now waited for me. When I spoke in a briefing, people wrote down what I said the first time instead of asking the man beside me to repeat it. It was subtle, and it was institutional, and it was, I will admit, a little bitter to taste, because I had been doing the same competent work for 20 years, and it had taken one colonel's bad morning to teach a whole building the manners it should have already had. I tried not to be bitter about it. I was only partly successful. There's a particular flavor of unfairness in watching a spectacle accomplish in 5 minutes what 2 decades of substance could not. And any woman who has done quiet, excellent work in a loud room knows exactly the taste I mean. Nathan changed too, in his own register. About 2 weeks after the test, he called me, and there was something new and slightly lost in his voice. I've got a capability brief tomorrow, he said. Big one. And I was sitting here building the pitch the way I always build it, all the bang, all the operator this, and warfighter that, and I realized I have been selling the bang my entire career, and I do not actually understand the part underneath it. The part you do. He took a breath. Can you teach me the part that matters? I don't even know what questions to ask. My brother, who had introduced me to a decade of strangers as the woman who picks the binder colors, was calling to ask me to teach him the substance behind his own sales pitch. I want to tell you I was gracious about it instantly. The truth is, I had to sit with the phone against my ear for a second and let an old, hard knot in my chest loosen before I could answer him. Then I said, of course, and I meant it, and I spent an hour that night teaching my older brother how to tell the difference between a weapon that works and a weapon that merely demonstrates. But the thing I remember most from those weeks happened on a Sunday, alone, at a cemetery a long drive from the post. I had not been to my father's grave since the spring. I went that Sunday because I needed to tell him, and because there was no one living who would understand it the way he would have. I sat down on the grass in front of the stone that said his name and his rank and his years. First sergeant, the rank he wore like it was the only one worth having. And I told him everything. I told him about the key, the small, cool weight of it in my palm. I told him about Dr. Keller walking past the colonel like he was a cone. I told him about the trace resolving on the screen exactly as the modeling promised, 10 years made real in a few seconds, and how one of my young engineers had laughed out loud from the pure relief of it. I told him about the salute. and then I told him the part I could not tell anyone living. "I'd have traded it, Dad," I said to the stone. "The whole morning, the key and the salute and the colonel's white face, I'd have traded all of it just to look up in that bunker and see you standing in the back in that coat that didn't fit, doing that still thing you did with your face." They finally turned around and looked at me. And the one person I built it all for wasn't in the room. The cemetery did not answer. They never do. I sat there a long while with my hand flat on the cold granite, and I let the two truths sit side by side, the proudest morning of my career and the loneliest evening of it, the way they had been sitting side by side since the moment Dr. Keller said my name on that line. Trust came back to me after that, but I made it come back the way I had made everything in my life come back, on terms, slowly, earned. I do not believe in the kind of forgiveness that costs nothing, because I have never once been on the receiving end of it. Every good thing I have was paid for in the unglamorous currency of showing up and getting it right when no one was watching. I was not about to start handing out absolution at a discount, not even to my own family. Colonel Dawes asked to see me about 10 days after his 2 days in the engineering bay. I expected another apology, and I had made my peace with enduring it. That is not what he came for. "Ma'am," he said, standing in my doorway. "I can't unsay what I said on that line. I've stopped trying to. But I've spent 26 years with the operational community, and those officers listened to me, and now I actually understand what your people built. I'd like to carry it to them. The warfighters trust a line colonel in a way they'll never trust a slide. Let me be useful to the thing I almost waved off the range." It was, I realized, the most honest thing he could have offered, and it cost him something to offer it. He was not asking to be forgiven, he was asking to be put to work. "You can start," I told him, "by telling them who actually makes the round land true. When you brief them, you use the word they, not the word I. You name the engineers. You make those officers understand there are people behind that weapon who will never be in the room, and that those people are the reason their soldiers come home. You do that, and you do it honestly, and then we'll talk about what else you can carry." He did it. I checked because I'm not naive, and he did it. Over the following weeks, Colonel Lawrence Dawes became something I never could have predicted on the morning he waved me toward the tent, an honest and credible advocate for the work, a line officer who had learned to see the builders. I did not become his friend. I became something more useful to both of us. I became someone he had stopped being able to dismiss, about anyone. Nathan kept showing up too, which is its own kind of proof. Talk is the cheapest thing my brother has ever traded in, and I had heard a lifetime of it from him, so I watched his actions instead. I watched him correct himself in front of our extended family when an uncle made the old binder's joke, watched him say, flatly, "No, that's not what she does. I had it backwards for 30 years. I watched him defend my work to a colleague at his firm when I was not in the room and had no way of knowing he had done it, except that the colleague mentioned it to me months later, surprised I did not already know. I used to say my sister picked the color of the binders, Nathan told me one evening, the two of us on my mother's porch. Turns out my sister decides whether the thing inside the binder kills the right people and spares the rest. I had it exactly backwards, Addie. The loud part was never the part that mattered. You and Dad both knew that, and I spent 50 years being too in love with the noise to hear you. Even my mother reached in the end in the only way she knew how. There is a small heritage hall at the program's headquarters, an unclassified display that honors the team, the people, and the milestones. The long road of the work laid out where families and visitors can see a sliver of it. I took my mother there on a quiet afternoon. She stood in front of the display for a long time, reading the few things she was allowed to read, looking at photographs of people she did not know who had spent their lives on the thing her daughter led. Your father would have stood here for an hour, she said softly. He'd have read every word twice. She reached out and touched the edge of the case, the way you touch something you are not sure you are allowed to. I think I finally see the shape of it, Adrienne. I can't see the inside. I never could. Your world was always behind a door I didn't have the key to. But I can see the shape of it now. I can see that it's big. I'm sorry it took me so long to even see the outside. I told her it was all right. And for the first time in my life, standing in that hall with my bewildered, reaching mother, it actually was. Not because she finally understood the work. She never would. Not really. but because she had stopped needing it to be small in order to feel close to me, and I had stopped needing her to understand it in order to feel like her daughter. We had a family dinner not long after that, the four of us who were left, my mother and Nathan, and his wife and me. And for the first time in my entire adult life, the conversation made room for my work without making a joke of it. Nathan asked a real question. My mother listened to the answer without her eyes glazing. It was a small thing, an ordinary dinner, and it undid something in me that 20 years of medals in a closet box had never been able to reach. The firing key did not do that. I want to be clear about it because it is the whole truth of this story. The key and the salute did not change my family. They simply made my family stop for one startled morning, long enough for a truth that had been standing in front of them their entire lives to finally walk through the open door. The months after the test were the best months my program ever had, and they were not about the firing line at all. They were about what the firing line had been for. The system moved from milestone test toward fielding. There's a long stretch of work between a successful shot and a weapon actually reaching soldiers, and most of it is exactly the invisible, unphotographed labor I had spent my life on. But it moved, and it moved well, because the data was real, and the team was good, and, for once, the institution above us was paying the kind of attention that clears obstacles instead of creating them. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday, Dr. Marion Keller called me into the test director's office at the proving ground, and she told me the system had been approved to go to the force. "It's going to soldiers, General," she said. She was not a sentimental woman, Marion, but her voice had something underneath it. "Whatever happens out there now, whatever a soldier downrange never finds out the hard way because this weapon does exactly what we promised it would do, that's you. That's this whole team. You built something that's going to bring people home who would not otherwise have come home, and almost none of them will ever know your name. You understand, that's the highest thing there is, in our line of work. The people you save never know to thank you." I did understand it. I had understood it since I was 12 years old on a milk crate. But there is a difference between understanding a thing and having someone who has earned the right say it out loud to you. And I held on to Marion's sentence the way I had once held on to my father's. A week later, Lieutenant General Sandoval called me with a different kind of news. "They were looking at me for more," he said. "A larger role, a bigger portfolio, the next rung. The kind of thing you spend a career positioning for." He told me it was mine to lose, and then he told me something else, in that blunt way of his that is always cut closer to the bone than he lets on. "They're going to ask you to do more, Adrian," he said. "And before you say yes, I want you to figure out what you've actually been chasing all these years. Because I watched you on that range, and I watched you turn down an easy revenge twice in one day, and I don't think you know yet what you caught that morning. You caught something. Make sure you know what it was before you go chasing the next thing." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. What had I been chasing? If I was honest, and at 50 there's very little point in being anything else. I had been chasing the same thing my whole life. I had been chasing the moment the room turns around. I had built a career of invisible excellence and then quietly, secretly, ached for it to be seen. By my mother, by my brother, by the line officers who looked past me to the man at my shoulder, by my father, who was the only one who ever actually did the seeing and who was gone before the room ever turned. I had caught it on that firing line. The room had turned around. The colonel had saluted. The building had recalibrated. My brother had finally seen me. I had gotten the exact thing I had wanted for 30 years. I thought a great deal those weeks about the 18-year-old who had walked into the Fire Direction Center and felt, for the first time, prized for the thing her family found strange. I thought about how much of the next 3 decades had been her, still underneath the rank and the gray hairs, waiting for the rest of the world to do what the army had done in that tent. I had built a whole life on the strength of one institution finally valuing me, and somewhere along the way I had let the valuing become the goal instead of the work. That is a quiet thing to discover about yourself at 50, in a kitchen with a key in your hand. And here was the strange, quiet truth I found at the bottom of it. The one I was still turning over when the thing happened that finished the story. Getting it had not filled the hole. The recognition was real, and I was glad of it, and it had genuinely changed things. But the ache it was supposed to cure was still there, a little quieter, not gone, and I began to suspect that it had never actually been an ache for other people to see me at all. I had spent my whole life proving I mattered to people who weren't looking. Now they were looking. And I realized the question was no longer whether they would ever see me. It was whether I had ever truly needed them to. I did not have the answer yet. I was close to it, the way you are close to a word on the tip of your tongue, when my mother handed me the thing that gave it to me. It was a box. She had been going through my father's things at last, 7 years on, the way grief eventually lets you. And at the bottom of a footlocker, she had found an envelope with my name on it in his blocky handwriting. He had written it, she thought, in his final year, and never found the moment or the nerve to give it to me. She handed it across her kitchen table without a word because she had read the name on the front and understood it was not hers to open. I took it home. I set it on my own kitchen table, and I looked at it for the better part of an hour without opening it. My father's handwriting spelling out Addie on the front. The proving ground key sitting in my other hand. The duplicate they had given me as a memento of the shot. And I sat there on the edge of understanding that the recognition I had spent 50 years chasing was something the one man who mattered had handed me long, long before I ever went looking for it from anyone else. I opened the envelope at my kitchen table, alone, with the firing key in my hand. My father was not a writer. The letter was short, in that blocky, careful hand, the same hand that had screwed the inert fuse back into its casing on the workbench 38 years before. I am going to give you the part that took the floor of the world and made it solid under my feet again, the way his voice always had. Addie, he wrote, you'll spend your whole life making sure the round land's true and nobody will ever see you do it. That's the job. I picked it for myself and you picked it for yourself, and it's the best work there is. And it is lonely as a country road at night because the people you save never know your name, and the people who love you can't follow you through the door. I know that loneliness. I watched you walk into it as a young woman, and I never had the words to tell you what I am going to tell you now. I saw you. From the garage on, I always saw you. Don't you spend your good years waiting for a room full of colonels to tell you what your old man knew when you were 12 years old standing on that milk crate. You were never small. You were the part that matters. Be at peace with that, the way I never quite managed to. Love, Dad. I sat with that for a long time. And the word I had been reaching for since the firing line, the one on the tip of my tongue when Sandoval asked me what I had been chasing, finally arrived. I had been collecting other people's recognition like a debt I was owed. And the whole time, the only person whose recognition had ever actually mattered to me had paid the debt in full before I ever raised my right hand and swore the oath. He had paid it in a garage when I was 12. He had paid it again on a bank of payphones when I was 22. He had written it down in his last year and carried it around, unable to hand it to me. And then he had died, and I had gone right on chasing from strangers the thing I had already been given. The hole did not close all at once. I will not lie to you and tell you that one letter undid 50 years. But something in me loosened that night and has stayed loosened. A knot I had been carrying so long I had stopped feeling it as separate from myself. I said yes to the larger role. But I said yes to it differently than the woman on the firing line would have. I took it because the work needed doing and I was good at it, not because the next rung might finally make the room turn around. And the first thing I did in the new job, before anything else, was learn the name of every single engineer on the new team. All of them. Because the people who make the round land true should at the very least be known by name to the one person who decides when to fire. A few weeks into it, I was out at a range, in uniform that day, stars and all, and I watched a young lieutenant get talked over in exactly the way I had been talked over for 20 years. A woman with a clipboard, the man beside her, getting the questions she should have been asked, her competence sliding off the room like water off glass. And I crossed the distance between us and I stood next to her where everyone could see, and I handed her a kind of firing key of her own. Lieutenant, I said, loud enough to carry, you're with the program. You don't wait in any tent and you don't stand at the back of any line. You stand right here, where the work is. That's an order. I watched her straighten. I watched the room recalibrate around her the way that firing line had recalibrated around me. Except that this young woman would not have to wait 30 years and bury her father to feel it. That, I think, is the only revenge that was ever worth anything. not the colonel's white face. The next woman's straight back. So let me say this to you, whoever you are, however you found your way to this story, if you have ever been the one nobody clapped for, if you have ever been the one waved toward the tent while you were the entire reason the thing on the line was going to work, if you have done the quiet, excellent labor that saves people who will never know your name and watch louder, smaller work take the credit and the photograph, then hear me, because I learned it the slow and lonely way, and I would spare you the slowness if I could. You do not need the room to turn around. You never did. The worth was always yours, sitting in your own two hands like a small, cool key, whether or not a single person in the building ever says your name out loud. But I will tell you the other true thing too, because it is also true. You do not need the room to turn around. And oh, the morning it does. If you've made it all the way here with me, thank you. Sitting at that grave and telling my father about the key was the hardest part of all of this to say out loud. And I'm glad I got to say it to you instead of keeping it. So let me ask you a few things, and I really do read the answers. Have you ever been the person in the room doing the work nobody claps for while the loud part got all the credit? Did the recognition ever finally come? And if it did it land the way you thought it would? Or did it arrive too late for the one person you wanted to see it? And is there someone in your life who taught you your worth long before the world ever caught up to it? Tell me in the comments. If this story reached something in you, hit subscribe and stay with me. The quiet ones deserve to be heard, and I'd like to keep telling theirs.